As you know, on Sunday night or Monday morning of every week, we post a new expository semiotics explaining why we would choose which lectionary readings. But in these readings, our dream is, and our desire is, to help you read the signs and fondle the details and spot the seminal metaphors, the condensed signs and the stories that are key for preaching to a digital culture. So strap on your seatbelt and join us as we prospect our passages for today. Our LenTalk today, vlog number 7, is from a reading chair that used to be in a Trappist monastery in the refectory. You can tell it's a refectory chair because of the carved bowl of fruit and grapes. And what would happen is, Trappists, as you know, have a vow of silence, but during meals, at the discretion of the abbot would assign somebody to climb up in the reading chair and break the silence by either reading a passage of scripture, was often a psalm, and sometimes they would even chant it together as they were reading, or some writing by another Trappist monk. And so the silence would be broken by either the scripture or the words and thoughts of another colleague from somewhere around the world. And this was one of those chairs that you would climb up into and read. So I am reading to you, and I'm going to read what you'd open up this little lid here, and you'd get out the book or the reading material that the abbot had put in there and had allowed you to read. So we're going to do that today. I'm going to read to you a little bit today because our texts are really so interesting that one of them, I think, deserves a real full extended elaboration. So that's what we're going to do. Our text today, Acts 2 and 42 to 47. And I love this day by day as they spent time together in the temple. They broke bread at home and they ate their food with glad and generous hearts. And this is appropriately a refectory reading chair. Breaking of bread, absolutely key, as we know, the importance of the table. And the table in the Jewish tradition is really what replaces the temple as the most sacred place for religious ritual. So a lot could be done on that. And the day by day, I love, some day by day songs, and the day by day, the life of discipleship is a day by day thing. And I love that phrase. We have Psalm 23, who cannot preach on that one, the great valley of the shadow of death, though I walk through the valley, through. The thing that separates a though, we all have to walk through the valley. Nobody gets out of life alive. So we all got valleys of shadows, both during life and at the end of life. But what turns a though into a through? Say, though I walk through, the promise is through, is that little letter R. And in American Sign Language, this is the letter R. You can do so much with that. Then we've got 1 Peter, the second chapter, 19 to 25. But the one I really want to focus on today with you is this passage from John 10. And this is the front to this incredible verse, John 10:10. I've come that you might have what kind of life? More abundant life, whole life, not half life, not term life, not quarter life, whole life. But here's how it begins. And Jesus is, I tell you the truth, Jesus has a little, we all have little mannerisms, and Jesus had this little mannerism, I tell you the truth, which really means, listen up, pay attention. The man who does not enter the sheep pen by the gate, but climbs in some other way, is a thief and a robber. So he begins to tell a story. Now, it's hard for us to Imagine this. But Jesus is always telling stories. He's the greatest storyteller who ever lived. But let's just get this right. 75% of the Bible is narrative. We've chopped it up and diced it up, sliced and diced into these verses. 75% of the Bible is narrative. It's story. 15% is poetry. Okay? So you got 75% story, 15% poetry. That's what the Psalms are. And more than the Psalms, because there's a lot of poetry in the Bible. But 10% is instruction and proposition. 10%. So 90% of the Bible appeals to our imagination, our right brain. 10% appeals to our left brain. Now, it's a whole brain experience. This is a whole brain. God gave us two brains, a right brain and a left brain, for a reason. Intellect, imagination, both are to be brought together. And they do here in this story. But let's get the proportions right. Okay, 90% is to the imagination. Prose, that's in the form of narrative, and poetry, which is basically metaphor. And then you got 10% proposition, instruction, doctrine, that kind of thing. So this is why this is such a key text for us today, because Jesus is always going, the kingdom of heaven is like, and then comes a metaphor. If he's not doing the kingdom of heaven is like, you assume it's there. And so here, this is what's happening here. The kingdom of heaven is like, okay. And then you get the story. And I need such small print here. The key is that Jesus tells a story about the shepherd and the flock. And when he's done with it, it says, Jesus used this figure of speech. This is verse 6, or metaphor. But they did not understand what he was telling them. Okay. So then it says, verse 7, that Jesus tried again. Okay. So those of you who are preaching and are going to use the 90%, the narrative, the metaphor, let me tell you, there's that 10%. Those 10% ruled for the last 500 years in the Gutenberg world, that 10%, the proposition, instruction, the left brain. They are often going to be like here, and they had no idea what he was saying. And so Jesus tried again. Jesus is always patient. And one of the questions is, how do you deal with people that just don't get it? That just don't get it. And go, well, I didn't know what the point was. Well, the point is not a point anyways, it's a person. But the point is the narrative itself, and people are just not. The point is the metaphor itself. They're not going to get that. So how does Jesus handle these people, and how does he do it? And he does it over and over again. I mean, you think of the story of Nicodemus, Nick by night, who comes to Jesus with this question, and Jesus answers this question with a metaphor. What must I do, to be saved? And Jesus goes, you got to be born again. Now that's a metaphor. And so Nicodemus goes, I got to crawl back into my mother's wombs and be born a second time? I mean, he doesn't get it, okay? So many of us this time, we wanted to be tearing our hair out. No, you're taking it literally. That's the 10%. You're taking it no. But Jesus is patient. And so he explains it again to Nicodemus and explains the metaphor of the rebirth, the second birth, the born again, what it means to have a heart that's reborn. And you know what? Thankfully, Nicodemus got it, because Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea were direct answers to Jesus' prayer on the cross. Because when he said, save me from the dogs, as he's singing Psalm 22, and save me from the dogs, a couple times he sings that. And the dogs would have been the ones that, as the vultures tore the flesh from the people that were left up there after they'd been crucified, the bones would fall down. And that's why there's no remains of anybody who's been crucified except for one. And Jesus was saved from the dogs because Nick and Joseph, Nick and Joe, went and took Jesus' body down from the cross and arranged to have it buried. So Nick got the metaphor. Nick by night. Thank you, Nicodemus. Thank you. And Jesus was patient with him. And the most extensive theological conversation Jesus ever had was with a woman at the well. Now, this woman who had, remember, 5 husbands. And it's all about metaphor. And he's talking about what she's talking about. He says, give me water. And she's well, what do you mean? Me give you water? And Jesus goes, I'm the living water. And, and so he's playing with he's the living water, and she's not getting it, but then he's engaging her and he's explaining it to her. Now, whenever you have wells, first time we meet a well in the Bible, well's a huge symbol. And John knows what he's doing here, because he's always, everything in John is out of Genesis. I mean, everything's coming out of Genesis. But first well in the Bible, you have water springing up in Genesis 2, but it's not a well. The first well we meet in the Bible is when Hagar escapes in the wilderness and finds a well, and God meets her at that well. Remember, and this is one of the most incredible passages, and this is Genesis 16. The angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. It was a spring that is beside the road to Shur. And the angel said, Hagar, servant of Sarah, where have you come from, and where are you going? Wow. I mean, this is the basic question of God to every one of us. Do you know where you come from? Do you know where you're going? You got to know your ancestry, but you also got to know your destiny, your pedigree, and your destiny. Do you know where you've come from? We need to know our past, but we also need to know our future. And at this, in this exchange, I'm running away from my mistress Sarah, and the angel of the Lord told her, go back to your mistress and submit to her. And then the angel of the Lord said, you are with child, and you will have a son, and you shall call him Ishmael. He will be a wild donkey. And then she gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her. Okay? That's why I trust these metaphors. You are the God who sees me, is what she names at the well. You are the God who sees me. For she said, I have now seen the one who sees me. That is why the well was called Beer Lahai Roi. It is still there between Kadesh and Bered. You are the God who sees me. Now, remember the story of the Samaritan woman at the well who had 5 husbands, and when she goes and she says, you got to meet this one. He sees me. This is the first male in her life. She's been manhandled by 5 men. This is the first male in her life who sees me. Oh, the well is a place where we meet the God who sees us. See, the power of these metaphors, you have to trust the metaphor. So I want to talk to you a little bit about, and I'm going to pull this out here, and I'm going to read to you a little bit today, something that I prepared on metaphor. And why metaphors are so important, and why, in spite of the people, that 10% out there, that just, what are you talking about? Where is my instruction? Where is my application? Where is my doctrine? Where is my principle today? I need these 3 propositions. I need these 3 P's or these 4 F's or whatever they are. And you got to be patient with them, and you got to love them, but you can't give in to them. I mean, every now and then you do 10%. But the key way in which we communicate and the way in which the brain is made is through, as Jesus did, is through metaphor. So I want to give you an image for the image of metaphor. So I'm giving metaphor an image, and I want you to think of it. You may not be familiar with this, but just look it up in physics. It's called a strange attractor. A strange attractor. And a strange attractor is, this is very familiar to physicists, so if you study any kind of, physics or biology, you know what I'm talking about. A strange attractor makes everything fall into place. It's that one thing that when you insert it into the midst of chaos, then suddenly everything lines up. Everything gathers together. It's like that magnet which organizes other kind of scattered filaments into place, and everything comes together. And that's the strange attractor. Strange attractors are paradoxical in that they display simultaneously stability and archetypal form, but instability in actualization. In other words, they have they always mean the same. They always are the same, but they're always changing depending on the context. And that's the power of a strange attractor. And metaphors have this paradoxical effect in that you can always count on them to convey the same kind of emotional impact and energy, but they work on people differently, and everybody will slide into their soul differently and speak to them differently, and that's the power of a strange attractor, a metaphor. I want to make clear, as I'm reading to you today, as you all are eating or whatever you're doing from my reading chair, that Christianity is built on a real person and a figurative image. Jesus was real. He is the Messiah. He's the anointed one, the very Son of God. But there is a metaphor on which Christianity is based, and that is the heart. So you've got a real, so there are these two strange attractors. One is the ultimate, S-A, the capital strange attractor is Jesus, but the small strange attractor, and this is what Jesus was trying to work on with Nicodemus, is a metaphor, the heart, the human heart. The heart is a real muscle, a cardiac pump with 4 chambers that shoots blood throughout your body. But in Christian theology, the heart is more than a muscle. Okay, it's a metaphor. It's a centering and controlling metaphor without which you cannot imagine Christian theology or ritual practice. So you've got a real person who's not a metaphor. The Messiah is not a metaphor. Jesus is not a metaphor. And those who just turn him into a metaphor, this is dangerous. But it's also built on a real person, Messiah, and it's also built on a metaphor, the heart. The heart is a metaphor of such complexity and subtlety that if you get the metaphor wrong, a lot can go wrong. And it has gone wrong in Christian history. Augustine warned about this when he said that the heart was more than the seat of our emotions or our best impulses, whether intellectual or moral, both of which are metaphorical uses of the heart, by the way. The heart was who we are, he said. It was the core of our being, he said. It was the seat of the divine within us. God inhabits the human heart. Now, that does not mean that God stuffs the Holy Spirit down the caves of our cardiac, okay? That's the 10% literalists will hear that. No. But even they will understand that the heart on which Christian theology is built is a metaphor. When we sing, "Since Jesus Came Into My Heart," we are singing metaphor theology. We don't literally mean that Jesus dive-bombed into our cardiac. We don't stuff Jesus down our throat here and into our caves. If we get a heart transplant or a mechanical heart, we are not removing Jesus from our lives, okay? So to hate metaphor is basically to hate Christian theology, because you can't have Christian theology without it's built on both an actual person who lived, died, and rose again and is rising daily, but also on a figurative metaphor without which we cannot understand the meaning of what the person who died, lived, and rose again did or is doing now. So to lose heart or to stray from the heart is to lose our very self, to lose our soul. And here's Augustine on what it means to lose heart or to abandon heart. I'm quoting here. "Why do you want to drift so far away from yourself? Turn back from your idle wandering. Return to the Lord. He is waiting. You have become a stranger to yourself. You do not recognize yourself, and you seek for him who created you." And this is the power of that metaphor of heart. Now, on the 25th of May, 1961, a couple weeks from now, an anniversary, one of the most memorable addresses ever delivered to a joint session of Congress was given by President John F. Kennedy. It's known by historians as the Moonshot Speech. And Kennedy celebrated the newly formed creation of the National Aeronautics and Space Agency, NASA, and challenged the nation, and I'm quoting here, to take longer strides, time for a great new American enterprise. And that great new American enterprise, as he called it, was to land on the moon by the end of the decade. The first flight director of NASA, Chris Kraft, read Kennedy's speech and blurted out, "Men on the moon, has he lost his mind?" This is the first director of NASA. And Robert Gilruth, then director of the Manned Spacecraft Center in Houston, told people he was aghast when he read this president's speech. How could he speak like this and speak for scientists like this? 2 years later, Kennedy gave another speech, which reinforced this call for a moonshot. It was given on the 21st of November, 1963, the day before he was assassinated. President Kennedy was in San Antonio, Texas, and gave a detailed itemization of the challenges of his call to mobilization of the nation for landing a man on the moon. Much of the technology, both hardware and software, had not been invented. Think about this. And it hadn't even been engineered or tested. So it wasn't invented, engineered, tested. NASA administration identified 10,000 separate tasks that would be necessary for landing on the moon and a return back to Earth. Later, they would tally 20,000 companies and 400,000 workers who participated in the developing of technologies that make the spacecraft and space launch possible. The challenge of what lay before the nation was symbolized in the name of the spacecraft, Apollo, after the Greek sun god, which was strapped to the Saturn rocket and carried the lunar landing module called Eagle, which landed on the surface of the moon the 29th of July, 1969, and then returned several hours later, 6 years. Kennedy did not know all this at the time. What he knew is that he needed something to keep the dream alive. So a day before he sat in a convertible for a parade in Dallas, he summed up a metaphor for what the entire nation and all its engineers and scientists and manufacturers were being asked to do. He got his metaphor from a book that had been published the year he gave his congressional address. In 1961, the celebrated writer Frank O'Connor published a memoir about his growing up in Ireland called An Only Child. And in this memoir, O'Connor told the story of how, in Kennedy's words, what Kennedy's telling us now, as a boy, he and his friends would wander the countryside, and when they came to an orchard wall that seemed too high and too doubtful to try and too difficult to permit their voyage to continue, they took off their hats and tossed them over the wall. And then they had no choice but to follow the hats. Those boys' bravado was what Kennedy said he was calling all of America to flaunt. Because he was assassinated the next day, the speech and its metaphorical manifesto and mandate to toss the hats over the wall was not given the attention it deserved. But NASA never forgot the metaphor. And it became the controlling metaphor for those in the space program. 6 years, that metaphor seeped out from there into lots of interesting places. Preachers in the 70s and 80s and 90s used the metaphor in their sermons, although they would often forget its source and wouldn't quote that it came from Kennedy or especially Mr. O'Connor. But a metaphor, you understand, a metaphor was the foundation of Apollo 11. And the metaphor, mantra of tossing the hat over the wall is partly responsible for the more famous metaphor, one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Notice Armstrong did not say, this is a great moment in history for us to intellectually comprehend and emotionally understand. What a great moment. Can you conceive of this? First human words spoken on another surface on the earth were a metaphor. To score a bullseye to the soul, curvy metaphors hit the mark harder and quicker than straight bullet points and declarative statements. The metaphor was the propulsive power for all of the breakthroughs, byproducts, and spin-offs that came from this mission to the moon. Historian Douglas Brinkley, in his just released American Moonshot that came out last year, lists some of these. I'm just going to, this is the power of a metaphor. This is what we got from that metaphor. Satellite TV, GPS, microchips, compact computers, CO2 detectors, improved solar panels, laser lights, metallurgic and fabric innovations, retractable arena roofs, dustbusters, portable vacuums, CAT scans, MRIs, radiation therapy, kidney dialysis, muscle stimulation devices, foldable walkers, lasers, ballistic missiles, anti-aircraft technology, and that's just the short list. Do you understand? Metaphors. Manufacture, manage, manipulate the world. I want to repeat that. Metaphors. Manufacture, manage, and manipulate the world. What kept the momentum going for such a heroic undertaking? A metaphor that NASA took to heart. If not the rest of the country, toss your hat over the wall. Ludwig Wittgenstein liked to say that metaphors have a way of dragging us along with them. And this metaphor dragged us all the way to the moon and back. So the power of metaphor. I can't emphasize enough. In fact, next week I may just spend a little more time developing this further with you. But when you preach, when you communicate the gospel, the Jesus method of communication is not, let me give you these 7 habits of highly effective discipleship. Write these down. It's the kingdom of heaven is like, and then came a metaphor. Like a lost coin. Like a lost sheep. And the greatest short story ever told. I mean, you go anywhere in the world, ask any professor of literature in any language, what's the greatest short story ever told? And chances are, 9 times out of 10, they will tell you there was this guy Jesus who told the story of a lost son. The power of a metaphor. Don't get discouraged by the 10%. Remember, 90%. Narrative, story, poetry, metaphor. Semiotics is the art of angling, of turning things askew, upside down, inside out, cattywampus, sunny side up, over easy, scrambled, hard-boiled. We hope you enjoyed today's journey, but always remember, it's more important you prepare the preacher than you prepare the sermon.